The thing about royal protocol is that it works beautifully, until it doesn't. And when it stops working, it tends to fail in the most spectacularly inconvenient ways possible. Ambassador Halen had witnessed his fair share of diplomatic disasters over the past 2 decades, but watching a pair of alien royal cubs slowly starve themselves to death while surrounded by the galaxy's finest delicacies, well, that was a new one for the resume. The Velnathi Empire had ruled this sector for over 3,000 years, and they'd built their reputation on two things: impeccable manners and an almost religious devotion to culinary perfection. Their homeworld, Velthara, was a testament to both. Gleaming spires that seemed to grow from crystalline gardens, where every meal was prepared according to rituals that made human tea ceremonies look like fast food drive-thrus, which made the current situation all the more absurd. "The young royals have not consumed sustenance for 6 rotations," announced court nutritionist Calandra, her whiskers twitching with barely concealed panic. The feline-featured alien stood nearly 8 feet tall, her ceremonial robes doing little to hide the fact that she was, quite frankly, losing her mind. "This is unprecedented." Halen nodded gravely, while internally noting that unprecedented was diplomat speak, for "we have absolutely no idea what we're doing." He glanced toward the ornate dining chamber where Prince Velmoth and Princess Velkia sat in miniature thrones, looking remarkably unimpressed by the parade of exotic dishes being presented to them. The cubs couldn't have been more than 4 years old in human terms, though with the Velnathi's extended lifespans, they were technically adolescents. They had the typical Velnathi features: sleek fur ranging from deep gold to silver, large expressive eyes, and ears that could swivel independently to track sounds. Under normal circumstances, they would have been absolutely adorable. These were not normal circumstances. "What exactly have you tried?" Halan asked, watching as a servant presented what appeared to be a small mountain of something that looked like crystallized starlight arranged on a plate made from compressed moon dust. Or at least, that's what the translator was telling him. Kalandra's tail, because of course the Velnathi had tails, swished in agitation. "Everything!" "The finest Velmari, from the singing lakes of Theron. Crystallized essence of the morning flowers that bloom only during the tri-lunar eclipse. We even prepared the legendary Feast of Ascension, reserved only for coronations." The cubs stared at the latest offering with the kind of polite disinterest that would have made British royalty proud, then simultaneously turned their heads to look at Halen. There was something almost accusatory in their gaze. "Have they said anything?" Halen inquired, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Royal cubs do not speak until their naming. Ceremony," Calandra replied, as if this were the most obvious thing in the galaxy. "It is tradition." Of course it was tradition. Everything was tradition with the Velnathi. They probably had a traditional way to breathe that involved reciting poetry to their ancestors. The coronation was supposed to take place in 3 days. Without it, the cubs couldn't officially inherit the throne. And without a legitimate ruler, the Velnathi Empire would face its first succession crisis in millennia. Several neighboring systems were already making noises about protecting Velnathi interests in case of governmental collapse, which was diplomatic speak for "we're planning to invade the moment you show weakness." No pressure at all. "Ambassador," came a voice from behind him. Halan turned to see Lieutenant Commander Nava approaching with that particular expression that meant she had observations to share. As his head of security, Nava had a talent for noticing things that everyone else missed. She also had a talent for delivering bad news with the emotional range of a particularly stoic rock. "Yes?" "The cubs have been watching us eat," she said simply. Holland blinked. "Excuse me. During yesterday's diplomatic luncheon and this morning's breakfast briefing, they keep looking at our food." Nava paused, considering her words carefully. "They seem interested." From across the chamber, communications specialist Finn looked up from his portable translator unit with a grin that suggested he'd just heard something entertaining. "Oh, this is rich. Let me guess. The royal furballs want people food instead of their fancy space cuisine." Calandra's whiskers flattened against her face in a way that suggested Finn had just committed approximately 15 different cultural faux pas. "The dietary requirements of Velnathi royalty are governed by sacred protocols dating back to—" Yeah, sacred protocols," Finn interrupted with a wave of his hand. "But when was the last time anyone asked the kids what they actually wanted to eat?" The silence that followed was the kind of silence that suggested Finn had just asked whether anyone had considered that water might be wet. "The royal children do not want," Calandra said stiffly. "They are provided with what is appropriate for their station and nutritional requirements." Halen watched the cubs, who had given up all pretense of paying attention to their meal, and were now openly staring at the human delegation. Prince Velmoth's ears were perked forward with obvious curiosity, while Princess Velkia had actually climbed down from her throne and was creeping closer to their table. "How long have they been alone?" Halan asked quietly. The question seemed to catch Calandra off guard. "Alone? They are surrounded by the finest caretakers, nutritionists, and protocol specialists in the Empire. They are hardly alone." "But no other cubs their age?" "Royal children do not socialize with common cubs until after their naming ceremony. It would be inappropriate." "Right." Halan nodded slowly, pieces of a very troubling puzzle beginning to fall into place. "And their parents?" Calandra's ears drooped slightly. "Lost in the transport accident 8 rotations ago. They were returning from the treaty summit on Kepler Station when their ship encountered an unexpected asteroid field. 8 days. The cubs had been orphaned 8 days ago, immediately thrust into a world of ceremonial isolation and ritual feeding, surrounded by adults who treated them like living symbols rather than children. And they'd stopped eating 6 days ago." Halan was no child psychologist, but he'd spent enough time around stressed mammals to recognize the signs. The cubs weren't just being picky eaters, they were shutting down. "Has anyone considered," he said carefully, "that they might be grieving?" The look Calandra gave him suggested he'd just proposed that gravity might be optional. "Velnathi cubs do not grieve in the manner of lesser species," she said, with the kind of certainty that suggested she'd never actually met any Velnathi cubs. "They are guided by instinct and proper nutrition. Emotion is a learned behavior that develops after the naming ceremony." Finn snorted. "Right, because 4-year-olds are famous for being logical about food choices." Princess Velkia had crept close enough to their table that she could reach out and touch Halen's chair. She sat down on the ornate floor, probably breaking about 6 different protocols in the process, and simply watched them eat. Her brother, not to be outdone, abandoned his throne entirely and padded over to sit beside her. Both cubs stared at the humans with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for scientists studying particularly interesting bacteria. "They're not eating because they're stressed," Nava observed with her usual directness. "And they're stressed because they're being treated like royal artifacts instead of children." That's not how Velnathi development works," Calandra protested, though her voice carried less conviction than before. "Maybe not," Halan said, watching Prince Velmoth's nose twitch as he caught the scent of Finn's emergency ration bar. But it's how children work. The cubs had lost their parents, been thrust into an alien world of ceremony and isolation, and were now expected to perform their roles as perfect little royals, while surrounded by adults who couldn't even acknowledge that they might be scared, lonely, or confused. And somehow, everyone was surprised that they'd stopped eating. Halan made a decision that would either save 2 young lives or end his diplomatic career. Possibly both. "Kalandra," he said, standing up from his chair. "I need to speak with the Royal Council immediately." The Council is in emergency session, discussing potential regency options should the cubs become unviable. Unviable. They were talking about 2 frightened children, as if they were failed experiments. "Then it's time they heard a different perspective," Halan said, his diplomatic smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Because I think I know what's wrong." The cubs watched him with those huge, intelligent eyes as he prepared to either solve an interstellar crisis or create one. In his experience, there usually wasn't much difference between the two. The Royal Council chamber looked like someone had crossed a cathedral with a courtroom and then decorated it with enough precious metals to fund a small war. Which, Halen reflected, was probably the point. 12 Velnathi nobles sat in a perfect circle, their ceremonial robes making them look like particularly judgmental flowers. At the center of the circle, a holographic display showed the cubs' vital signs in real time: heart rate, stress hormones, nutritional deficiencies. The numbers weren't encouraging. "Ambassador Halan," intoned High Counselor Morveth, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd never been contradicted in his life. "You requested this audience regarding the royal nutrition crisis." "I did." Halan stepped forward, flanked by Nava and Finn. The cubs had tried to follow them, but protocol officers had gently but firmly redirected them back to their chambers. "I believe I understand why the cubs aren't eating." "Please," Morveth gestured with one elegant clawed hand. "Enlighten us." Halan took a breath. Here went nothing. "They're lonely." The silence that followed could have been cut with a knife and served as an appetizer. Several council members exchanged the kind of looks usually reserved for people who'd just suggested that mathematics might be subjective. "Lonely?" Councillor Thelvara spoke the word as if it were a foreign concept, which, for all Halen knew, it might be. "Think about it from their perspective," Halan continued. "They've lost their parents. They're surrounded by adults who treat them like living ceremonies instead of children. They eat alone, sleep alone, and spend their days being lectured about protocols they're too young to understand." "This is proper royal upbringing," Morveth said firmly. "Velnathi royalty must be raised above common social attachments to serve the greater good." "Right," Finn muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Because nothing says serving the greater good like starving yourself to death." Nava shot him a warning look, but the damage was done. Councillor Thelvara's ears flattened against her skull. "Your subordinate shows remarkable disrespect for our customs, Ambassador." "My subordinate," Halan replied smoothly, "shows remarkable concern for 2 children who are dying while we debate customs." That hit home. The holographic display flickered, updating the cubs' status. Their energy levels had dropped another 3% in the past hour. "What do you propose?" asked Councillor Velandra, the youngest member of the council, and, from what Halan had observed, the only one who seemed genuinely worried about the cubs rather than the political implications. "Let them eat with us!" The reaction was immediate and about as subtle as a supernova. Half the council started talking at once, their voices creating a cacophony that the universal translator gave up trying to process. The other half sat in stunned silence, as if Halen had just suggested they sacrifice the cubs to ancient space gods. Absolutely not. Morveth's voice cut through the chaos. Royal cubs cannot consume common food. The nutritional requirements alone are clearly not being met by your current approach, Nava interrupted, with characteristic bluntness. Dead cubs don't have nutritional requirements. The cubs are not dying, Delvara protested. They are simply adjusting to their new circumstances. By refusing to eat for 6 days straight, Finn pulled out his datapad and started reading. Let's see. Dehydration, muscle atrophy, declining cognitive function. Yeah, that sounds like adjusting to me. Halan held up a hand before the situation could devolve further. I'm not suggesting we abandon your traditions entirely, but maybe we could bend them slightly, just until the cubs are stable. You don't understand. Calandra had entered the chamber and was wringing her hands in a way that suggested she was about 5 minutes away from a complete nervous breakdown. The royal dietary protocols aren't just tradition. They're sacred law. Every ingredient must be blessed by the temple of eternal nourishment. Every preparation must follow the codex of royal sustenance. Every meal must be served according to the rituals of worthy consumption. And how's that working out for you? Finn asked sweetly. Before anyone could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the palace. The holographic display flashed urgent red warnings as both cubs' vital signs plummeted simultaneously. They've collapsed, Valandra whispered, her face going pale beneath her fur. The council chamber erupted into chaos. Nobles shouted orders, medical teams were summoned, and emergency protocols activated. Through it all, Halan found himself thinking about something his own grandmother used to say. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is just sit with them and share a simple meal. The cubs were rushed to the Royal Medical Bay, where teams of physicians surrounded them with equipment that hummed and beeped with ominous efficiency. Halan, Nava, and Finn were relegated to the observation deck, watching through reinforced transparisteel as the medical drama unfolded below. They're stable, reported Chief Physician Nalketh, after what felt like hours. But barely. Their bodies are beginning to shut down non-essential functions. How long do they have? Morveth demanded. Perhaps 2 rotations, maybe less. 2 days. The coronation was supposed to be in 3. There has to be something we can do, Valandra said desperately. Some food they'll accept. Some way to... We've tried. Everything! Calandra's composure finally cracked completely. Every delicacy in the known galaxy. Fruits that grow only in the hearts of dying stars. Proteins harvested from creatures that exist in 17 dimensions. Nothing works. Halan watched the cubs through the observation window. Even unconscious, they'd somehow managed to curl up together on the same medical bed, their small bodies seeking the comfort and warmth that had been systematically denied to them since their parents' death. You know what I think? Finn said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather instead of an interstellar succession crisis. I think they're not eating because they don't want to eat alone. That's... Calandra started to object, then stopped. That's not... Velnathi cubs are naturally solitary until their naming ceremony. It's biological imperative. Says who? Nava asked. Says tradition and biological studies. And when was the last time anyone actually studied Velnathi cubs in a natural setting? Halen asked gently. Not royal cubs raised in isolation, but regular children in families. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. The royal lineage has been maintained in traditional isolation for over 2,000 years, Morveth said finally. There haven't been studies of common cubs, because royal protocols supersede. You've been conducting a 3,000-year experiment in social isolation, Finn said with dawning realization, and you don't even have a control group. Below them, Princess Velkia stirred slightly and made a small sound that the translator rendered as a distressed mew. Her brother immediately shifted closer, even in sleep. Look at them, Helen said softly. Really look at them. They're not acting like solitary creatures. They're acting like pack animals. Velnathi are not pack animals, Thelvara said automatically, but her voice lacked conviction. Maybe royal Velnathi aren't, Nava observed, but maybe that's the problem. The medical monitors continued their steady rhythm, marking time that was running out faster than anyone wanted to admit. In 3 days, either these cubs would be crowned as the new rulers of the Velnathi Empire, or there wouldn't be a Velnathi Empire left to rule. And somewhere in the space between tradition and survival, Halan was beginning to form a plan that would either save 2 young lives or get him banned from diplomatic service forever. Probably both. I need to make a few calls, he announced, heading for the door. Ambassador, Morveth called after him. What exactly are you planning? Halen paused at the threshold, looking back at the assembled nobles who'd spent 6 days watching children starve rather than question their precious protocols. I'm going to do something completely inappropriate, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm going to treat them like kids. Behind him, he could hear Finn chuckling. This is going to be fun. Nava just sighed. Define fun. As they left the council chamber, neither the nobles nor the medical staff noticed that the cubs' stress levels had actually decreased slightly during the humans' visit. But the monitoring equipment recorded it faithfully, adding one more piece of data to a puzzle that no one was quite ready to solve. Yet, what Holland had in mind wasn't technically treason, but it was definitely going to void his diplomatic immunity. He stood outside the Royal Medical Bay at what the Velnathi called the Dark Cycle, essentially midnight, holding a standard-issue human military MRE and wondering if this was the stupidest thing he'd ever done in 20 years of diplomacy. The competition was fierce. This is insane, Nava whispered, though she'd been the one to help him bypass the security protocols. If this goes wrong, 2 kids die, and we probably start a war, Holland replied cheerfully. If it goes right, we save their lives and revolutionize Velnathi child-rearing practices. I like those odds. Your math is terrible, Finn observed, but he was grinning as he said it. He'd been the one to suggest which MRE to bring. But I have to admit, I'm curious to see what happens when we feed alien royalty, something that comes in a brown plastic bag. The cubs were awake. Barely. They lay curled together on the medical bed, their breathing shallow and their beautiful fur dulled by malnutrition. The sight made Halen's chest tighten with something that had nothing to do with diplomatic protocol. Hey there, he said softly, approaching their bed with the kind of careful movement he'd learned from years of dealing with skittish dignitaries. Mind if we join you? Prince Velmoth's ears twitched, and both cubs opened their large eyes to watch the humans approach. No fear, Holland noted, just exhaustion, and something that might have been hope. We brought dinner, Finn announced, settling cross-legged on the floor beside their bed. Nothing fancy. Just what we eat when we're far from home and missing people we care about. He opened the MRE with practiced efficiency, the familiar sound of tearing plastic unusually loud in the sterile medical bay. The smell that emerged was Well, calling it appetizing would be generous. But it was warm, and it was real, and it was the kind of food that said, "We're all in this together," instead of "You are alone on a pedestal." Princess Velkia's nose twitched. "It's not much to look at," Halon admitted, settling down beside Finn. "Beef stew, technically, though I've never been entirely convinced it's actually beef." Nava took position on the other side of the cub's bed, opening her own ration with military precision. The secret is not thinking too hard about the ingredients. Both cubs sat up slowly, their movements weak but determined. They watched with fascination as the humans began eating their simple meal, talking quietly among themselves about nothing in particular. Mission reports, weather back on Earth, whether Finn would ever learn to play poker without telegraphing his hand. Normal conversation, the kind that happened around dinner tables across the galaxy when people just wanted to share food and company. Prince Velmoth made a small sound, not quite a word, but clearly a request. "Want to try some?" Halon asked, offering a spoonful of the questionable stew. The cub leaned forward and sniffed delicately, then opened his mouth. The first bite was tentative. The second was more confident. By the third, both cubs were reaching for the spoon, with desperate hunger. "Well, I'll be damned," Finn murmured, watching Princess Velkia wolf down a protein bar with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered fire. They just wanted people food. But it wasn't just the food, Halon realized. It was the way they were eating, sitting together on the floor, sharing from the same containers, talking and laughing quietly while they ate. The cubs weren't just hungry for nutrition, they were starving for normalcy. "More?" Velkia asked, in perfectly clear standard, her first spoken word causing all three humans to freeze in surprise. "Did she just—" Nava started. "Talk?" "Yeah," Finn grinned. "And her first word was basically, 'Gimme food.' I like this kid already." They fed the cubs everything they had. MREs, protein bars, even some questionable energy drinks that Finn swore by. The cubs ate with the desperate efficiency of people who'd been waiting their entire lives for a real meal. It was, of course, exactly the moment that Calandra chose to make her rounds. The court nutritionist's shriek of horror could probably be heard 3 star systems over. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice climbing several octaves into ranges that made dogs back on Earth start howling. "You're feeding the royal heirs. Military rations." "Yep," Finn said, not looking up from where he was showing Prince Velmoth how to squeeze cheese from a tube. "And they love it. This is... Calandra struggled for words that could adequately express her outrage. "This is sacrilege. Those substances haven't been blessed. They haven't been purified. They haven't even been analyzed for royal compatibility." "They have been tested for basic edibility," Nava pointed out, "which puts them ahead of whatever crystal dust you've been trying to force-feed them." Princess Velkia, apparently deciding that the adults were taking too long to resolve this fascinating debate, reached up and tugged on Calandra's robes. When the startled nutritionist looked down, the cub offered her a bite of protein bar. "Want some?" Velkia asked in that clear, piping voice. "It's good." Calandra stared at the offered food as if it were a live explosive. You? This is not appropriate." "She talked," Halon said quietly. "Both of them talked, before their naming ceremony." That stopped the protests cold. In Velnati culture, early speech was considered a sign of exceptional intelligence and strong will. It was also supposed to be impossible under current royal protocols. "They spoke because they're happy," Velmoth announced, apparently deciding to join the conversation. His standard was accented but clear. Food tastes better when you're happy. The medical monitors, still faithfully recording every biological function, showed stress hormones dropping to normal levels for the first time in days. Energy levels were climbing. Heart rates had stabilized. "Impossible," Calandra whispered, staring at the readouts. "The nutritional content of those rations is inferior to our prepared meals in every measurable way." "Maybe," Holland said, watching the cubs share Finn's last energy bar with the kind of contentment he hadn't seen from them since his arrival. "But they're not just eating nutrients. They're eating with friends." "Friends?" Morveth had appeared in the doorway, having apparently followed Calandra's screams of horror. "Royal cubs do not have friends. They have subjects and advisors." "Looks like these royal cubs didn't get the memo," Finn said cheerfully. Princess Velkia had finished her share of the energy bar and was now attempting to climb onto Nava's lap. The lieutenant commander, who'd faced down armed insurrections without blinking, looked mildly panicked at the prospect of cuddling with alien royalty. "Permission to hold the princess?" she asked formally. "You don't need permission," Velkia announced, successfully completing her climb and settling in with a contented purr that made the universal translator hiccup. "We're pack now." Pack. The word hung in the air like a revelation, and Holland watched as understanding dawned on several faces at once. "Pack behavior," Calandra breathed. "But that's primitive. We evolved beyond pack structures millennia ago." "Did you?" Nava asked, absently stroking Velkia's fur while the cub purred like a small engine. "Or did you just decide that evolution was inconvenient for royal protocols? Prince Velmoth had discovered that humans had opposable thumbs that were excellent for opening food packages, and was currently attempting to convince Halen to help him access another MRE. His persistence was both adorable and completely ruthless. "Please," he asked, adding a slight purr to his voice that suggested he understood exactly how cute he was. "The brown bags have the best surprise foods." "Kid's got a point," Finn said. "MRE roulette is half the fun." As if summoned by the chaos, the rest of the Royal Council began filing into the medical bay. They stopped en masse at the sight of their future rulers sitting on the floor, sharing military rations with humans and looking happier than they had since their parents' death. "This is completely unacceptable," Thelvara announced, though her protest lacked its usual fire. It was hard to argue with success when the cubs were clearly thriving for the first time in days. "Is it?" Councillor Valandra stepped forward, studying the scene with intelligent eyes. "They're eating. They're talking. Their vital signs are normal. Maybe we should ask ourselves why this works when our traditional methods failed." "Because tradition is wrong," Velmoth said matter-of-factly, having apparently mastered both standard and the art of casual blasphemy. "Food is better when you share it with people you like." The royal cubs had just called 3,000 years of Velnathi cultural evolution categorically wrong, and they'd done it while covered in cheese dust from a military ration pack. Holland had to admit he'd seen less effective diplomatic coups. "This cannot continue," Morveth said weakly. "The coronation, the protocols. What will the other noble houses think?" "They'll think you found a way to keep the heirs alive," Halan suggested, "which is generally considered good governance. But the sacred meal traditions can adapt," Princess Velkia interrupted, demonstrating that royal authority worked just fine even when delivered by a 4-year-old with crumbs on her whiskers. "We want to eat with our pack. Your pack consists of alien military personnel," Thelvara pointed out desperately. "So, both cubs said in unison, with the kind of perfect timing that suggested they'd been practicing this routine. Holland looked around the medical bay at the assembled nobles, physicians, and protocol officers, all staring at two small cubs who'd just redefined the future of their empire with MREs and casual conversation. "Well," he said with diplomatic understatement, "this should be interesting." The cubs, having successfully revolutionized several thousand years of royal tradition, celebrated by demanding that Finn teach them the proper way to squeeze cheese from a tube. It was, Halan reflected, probably the most productive diplomatic breakthrough of his career. Even if it was about to cause a political crisis that would make the galactic trade wars look like a minor disagreement. The next few hours unfolded with the kind of surreal intensity that made Halen wonder if someone had slipped hallucinogens into the palace's atmospheric recycling system. Word of the cubs' miraculous recovery spread through the royal complex faster than gossip at a diplomat's cocktail party, and soon the medical bay resembled a very confused parade. Noble houses sent representatives to witness the miracle feeding. Religious officials arrived to determine if divine intervention was involved. Even the palace's kitchen staff showed up, apparently desperate to understand how military rations had succeeded, where their artisanal masterpieces had failed. Through it all, the cubs continued eating with the single-minded determination of people making up for lost time. They'd moved on from MREs to sampling everything in the humans' emergency food supplies, providing running commentary that was both hilarious and diplomatically catastrophic. "This one tastes like happiness," Princess Velkia announced, holding up a chocolate energy bar. "Why don't we have happiness food in the palace?" "Because happiness isn't traditionally considered a flavor profile," Calandra muttered, though she was frantically taking notes on everything the cubs consumed. "That's silly," Prince Velmoth observed, having discovered the joy of crackers that came with individual cheese packets. "All food should taste like happiness, or at least not like sadness." "What does sadness taste like?" Finn asked, genuinely curious. Both cubs considered this seriously. "Purple," they said in unison, then dissolved into giggles at their own synchronization. The assembled nobles watched this exchange with expressions ranging from bewilderment to barely concealed horror. Watching your future rulers develop personality was apparently not part of traditional royal protocols. "Ambassador," High Counselor Morveth approached with the careful movements of someone walking through a minefield. "While we are grateful for your intervention, we must discuss the implications of this situation." "Such as?" "The cubs have consumed unauthorized sustenance. They have spoken before their naming ceremony. They have—" Morveth gestured helplessly at where Prince Velmoth was attempting to teach Nava a traditional Velnathi hand game, while Princess Velkia braided Finn's hair with tiny, careful claws. "They have formed inappropriate social attachments." "You mean they've made friends?" Hallen translated. "Exactly. And this is a problem because—" Morveth looked at him as if he'd just asked why water was wet. "Royal children cannot have friends. Emotional attachments compromise judgment. Personal relationships create conflicts of interest. It is the foundation of effective governance." "Right," Hallen nodded slowly. "Because history is full of examples of emotionally isolated leaders making brilliant decisions." The sarcasm was apparently lost in translation, because Morveth nodded earnestly. "Precisely. Effective leadership requires—" "Empathy," Velkia interrupted, looking up from her hairdressing project. "Mama said good leaders care about people. That's why they make good choices." The medical bay fell silent, except for the quiet humming of monitoring equipment. Even the cubs seemed to realize they'd said something significant. "Your mother told you that?" Counselor Velandra asked gently. Before the trip, Velmoth confirmed, having abandoned his game to sit closer to his sister. She said we'd be leaders someday, and leaders need to understand how normal people live. That's why she wanted to take us to the colony worlds after the treaty signing. More silence. Holland was beginning to understand that the cubs' parents had been planning something very different from traditional royal isolation. A plan that had died with them in an asteroid field. The former queen intended to expose the cubs to common experiences? Calandra asked, her voice faint. She said we needed to learn about real life before we could help with real problems, Princess Velkia explained, then brightened considerably. Like this. We learned that humans share food when people are sad, and that makes everyone feel better. That's not how royal education works, Thelvara protested weakly. Maybe it should be, Nava said quietly. The cubs had finished eating and were now engaged in what appeared to be a very serious discussion about the relative merits of different human snack foods. Their energy levels were climbing steadily, their fur regaining its natural luster, and their voices growing stronger with every passing minute. The coronation is in 2 days, Morveth said finally. We cannot present cubs who have been contaminated by foreign customs. Contaminated? Finn's voice carried a dangerous edge. They're healthy for the first time in a week. They are no longer purely Velnathi in their development, Thelvara clarified. The other noble houses will question their legitimacy. The ceremonial protocols will be meaningless if the cubs have adopted alien behaviors. Holland felt his diplomatic composure slip slightly. So, you'd rather have dead cubs than ones who've learned to make friends? We would rather have proper heirs who understand their duties, Morveth replied stiffly. That's when Princess Velkia stood up on her medical bed, drew herself up to her full height, which wasn't particularly impressive, but somehow managed to command the room anyway, and delivered the kind of royal proclamation that would be quoted in history books. We are Velkia and Velmoth, heirs to the Velnathi throne, she announced in a voice that carried surprising authority for someone who'd been near death a few hours earlier. And we declare that our first royal decree will be that no cub in our empire shall ever eat alone again. Furthermore, Prince Velmoth added, clearly having planned this speech with his sister, we declare that friendship is not contamination. It is strength. And furthermore, Velkia continued, warming to her theme, we declare that anyone who thinks caring about people makes you weak is too stupid to be an advisor. The silence that followed could have been used to preserve food. Well, Halen said eventually, fighting to keep a straight face. I think we have our answer about the coronation. Finn was openly grinning. Kid's got a point about the advisor thing. The cubs, having apparently exhausted their supply of royal proclamations, settled back down and promptly fell asleep in a pile that included all 3 humans. Within minutes, they were purring in their sleep, a sound that the medical monitors registered as the most peaceful rest they'd had since becoming orphans. Around them, the assembled nobles and officials stood in various states of shock, confusion, and dawning realization. The cubs had just rewritten the rules of their entire civilization, using military rations and common sense. And somehow, it was working. The coronation of Prince Velmoth and Princess Velkia went down in galactic history as either the most progressive ceremony ever held or the most scandalous breach of protocol in 3 millennia, depending on who you asked. The cubs insisted on sharing their coronation feast with their pack, which now officially included the entire human diplomatic mission. They also insisted that the traditional feast include both ceremonial Velnathi delicacies and human military rations, served side by side on the same plates. "This is unprecedented," High Counselor Morveth muttered for the 100th time that morning, watching palace chefs attempt to garnish beef stew with crystallized starlight essence. "Good," Princess Velkia replied, with the confidence of someone who'd discovered that being royalty meant people had to listen to your opinions. "Precedent is boring." The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of diplomatic compromise. The cubs wore their traditional coronation robes, made from threads spun by extinct space silkworms and blessed by 17 different religious orders, while eating chocolate chip cookies that Finn had somehow procured from the human embassy's emergency supplies. "Do you, Velkia of the First House, accept the sacred responsibilities of the Velnathi throne?" intoned the high priest, following a script that hadn't changed in centuries. "I do," she replied solemnly, then brightened. "Can I share the throne?" "It's really big for just one person." "Royal siblings traditionally share governing duties," the high priest confirmed, though his expression suggested this wasn't quite what the ancient texts had in mind. "Not with him," Velkia clarified, pointing at her brother. "With everyone. Governing should be like dinner. Better when everyone gets to participate." The assembled nobility exchanged glances that ranged from confused to mildly terrified. Their new queen had just suggested democratizing the monarchy using dinner party logic. Prince Velmoth's coronation proceeded slightly more traditionally, right up until he declared that his first royal decree would be the establishment of pack-feeding protocols for all cubs in the Empire. "No more eating alone," he announced to the gathered crowd. "No more sad food, and definitely no more purple-tasting things." The crowd, a mixture of Velnathi nobles, foreign dignitaries, and increasingly bewildered protocol officers, erupted into the kind of murmur that suggested they weren't entirely sure what they'd just witnessed. Furthermore, Princess Velkia added, apparently not finished revolutionizing her civilization, "We decree that all royal meals shall include at least one food item that comes in a brown plastic bag, because those taste like friendship." Ambassador Halen, standing in the place of honor reserved for foreign dignitaries, tried very hard not to laugh. The cubs had just institutionalized military rations as part of royal protocol. Somewhere in the galaxy, a military quartermaster was about to become very wealthy. The reception that followed was unlike anything in Velnathi history. Instead of the traditional formal dining arrangements, where each guest ate in carefully ranked isolation, the cubs insisted on what they called floor feast style. Everyone sat in a large circle, sharing food from common plates, and engaging in the kind of casual conversation that made protocol officers break out in nervous sweats. "This is chaos," Calandra observed, though she was smiling as she watched the cubs demonstrate proper MRE opening technique to a group of fascinated noble children who'd been smuggled into the reception by parents suddenly questioning their own parenting choices. "Productive chaos," Counselor Velandra corrected, settling down beside them with a plate that contained both traditional delicacies and what appeared to be a peanut butter sandwich. "Look around. When was the last time you saw Velnathi children laughing?" She had a point. The reception was filled with the kind of joyful noise that the palace hadn't heard in living memory. Cubs from various noble houses were learning human games, while their parents engaged in actual conversations instead of formal exchanges of predetermined pleasantries. "The humans saved more than the royal cubs," Nava observed quietly to Halen. "They might have saved your entire culture from suffocating on its own traditions." "Time will tell," Halen replied, watching Prince Velmoth attempt to teach the Velnathi Minister of Agriculture the finer points of rock, paper, scissors. But I think these kids are going to do just fine. As the celebration continued around them, Princess Velkia approached Hallen with a serious expression. "Thank you," she said formally, "for teaching us that caring about people isn't weak." "You taught yourselves that," Hallen replied. "We just shared some snacks." "The best lessons happen over snacks," she said sagely, then ruined the moment by adding, "Do you have any more of those cheese tubes? They're amazing." 6 months later, the Velnathi Empire had become the fastest-growing civilization in the sector, powered by a new generation of leaders who understood that strength came from connection, not isolation. The royal pack-feeding protocols had been adopted by dozens of other species, and human military rations had become a symbol of friendship across the galaxy. The cubs, now properly crowned and slightly less fond of cheese tubes, ruled with the kind of compassionate pragmatism that made their advisors simultaneously proud and mildly terrified. And somewhere in the universe, there was probably a moral about the power of simple kindness and shared meals. But honestly, sometimes the best stories are the ones where hungry kids get fed, make friends, and accidentally change the galaxy. Those tend to work out just fine.